Welcome to Fringe Element here on the 440 Sports Network. My name is Braden Gall, and you can follow me on Twitter at Braden Gall.
And I'm Stephen Lassen. You can follow me on Twitter at AflonSteven, and you can check out my work at aflonsports.com. Pretty
strange show today. Normally, Aaron Dugan, of course, is hanging out with us. She's dealing with some family stuff. So Stephen Lassen, which you've heard, of course, on this particular podcast, each and every week making picks against the spread. You can check out our bowl preview edition, by the way, which we recorded before the tragic passing of Mike Leach. So just a bizarre show, Stephen, today with the news of Mike Leach. You have to sort of reflect on who he was, which we're going to do with Chris Childers. He and I had an opportunity to both work with Mike Leach at SiriusXM. We had an opportunity to I fell in love with radio because I got to interview Mike Leach. So we're going to talk with Chris about sort of who he is. Stephen, you and I are going to spend some time sort of making sure people understand the other side of Mike Leach, because the personality gets all the coverage, but really the football acumen, the statistical, sort of anomaly that he was in the air raid in the SEC and what he meant. We'll do that today on the show. We'll talk. We'll go through my Heisman Trophy ballot, which had 2 SEC players on it, neither of which were Stetson Bennett. We'll get into that, and of course, every single coordinator change in the SEC, Stephen, we're going to get you to rate and sort of review, as all you out there should rate, review, subscribe, and check out the YouTube page. We'll do that with all of the coordinators that have changed so far, and please God, let one of them be Bobby Petrino in College Station. That's all I can say about that.
Yes, agree. Yeah, those of us in the content industry are we don't root often for things to happen, but we root for good storylines. We root for overtime, right, as you always say. We're rooting for certain coaching hires to happen this cycle.
So obviously a lot to get to. We will hear from Chris Childers on Mike Leach fairly early in the show today, and then we're going to spend some time trying to talk regular football, but just a strange week. And so with Aaron being gone, Stephen, of course, my right-hand man on the Cover 2 podcast, we talk all things college football across the entire country and every single conference, the Cover 2 podcast from Athlon Sports. So make sure if you want more college football from us, you can always catch Stephen and I each and every week. Of course, we'll talk a lot about Mike Leach on that show as well, but from a different perspective, more from a Washington State, Texas Tech sort of national perspective with Mike Leach. So we'll do that on the Cover 2. So make sure you check that out. And Stephen, your YouTube page?
All CFB 365.
There you have it, athlonsports.com. If you want to follow every single player in the transfer portal, athlonsports.com is your place.
I got you covered.
there you go. Stephen's got you covered. So before we hear from Chris and sort of get to know the personality, because again, I feel very lucky and fortunate to have interacted so much with Mike Leach. So I want to touch on the data and the stats and what he meant to the game itself. Before we do any of that, however, we have to let people know and remind folks that the Fringe Element podcast and YouTube page is brought to you by
J.E. Dunn. Braden, they are our wonderful friends. If you're looking for a career change, J.E. Dunn, they want you to come work for them. Locations all across the Southeast. Braden's been to their offices. He talks up the facilities. He tells me about them all the time. I've had friends that are potentially looking for a career change. So you know what I did? I wrote myself a reminder to send them the application to J.E. Dunn.
Yeah, just go to jedunn.com, click on careers up there at the top. There's over 200 jobs available. You need no experience in construction. You need experience like wanting to be a part of a team, wanting to buy into a culture, and wanting to work for someone who cares as much about your career as you do. Top 100 healthiest place to work in the United States. Offices all across the Southeast, if you're an SEC football fan listening to this, which I assume you are. And $5 billion in annual revenue. So they've got the resources to take care of their people. They are the Alabama of the construction world right now. So just go work at, you want to go work at the greatest of all time, you go work at J.E. Dunn. I mean, I think it's a fact. I mean, maybe it's an opinion, but I think it's a fact that it's the greatest company of all time. All time.
I mean, considering how long they've been around, I think that says something. They are, I think you said it best. They are the Alabama and Georgia of
both. They're both of them.
Of employers. So I think it's like you said, you've been to their offices, Braden, you rave about them. You've told about it many times. So many times. If you're quiet quitting or if you're quitting loudly, I guess,
just overtly quitting,
right?
By quitting, go check out J.E. Dunn. Okay. So Chris is going to kind of give you a look into the personality type of Mike Leach, which again, I think anyone who's been around him, Stephen, you're getting all the stories right now because everybody who had an interaction with him was affected by him. And I personally, again, as a 23, 24-year-old kid, he did not need to give me 25-minute interviews about West Texas jackrabbits and, wedding crashers and like all this stuff that I'll explain with Chris. But he just was so good with his time, and he was willing to just be himself, even though, I was a 23, 24-year-old punk kid. So there's the personality side of Mike Leach that I think is really important. And Chris is going to do a great job explaining that. We'll have a conversation about that in just a few minutes. But I think there's this whole other side of Mike Leach that's almost like missed to some degree because of all the personality quirks and how big he was, how captivating he was to the college football world, that you can almost forget how influential his name will be 100 years from now when we write the book about the passing offense in college, pro, high school, Friday, Saturday, Sunday football. There's Air Coryell, there's Bill Walsh, there's Lavelle Edwards, which is a direct line to Mike Leach. And then there's Mike Leach. Mike Leach is a pretty big chapter of SEC football and passing offense and the evolution of this game.
Yeah, he really is. I think it's pretty remarkable that when you step back for a second and you look at his coaching tree just all across college football. I mean, you look at guys like Lincoln Riley, Dana Holgerson, Dave Aranda, they've all coached under him. Dave Aranda being more of a defensive guy. But it's not just the coaches, it's sort of the just overall influence on the game. You mentioned Coryell and Bill Walsh and all those guys. We start thinking like 40, 50 years from now and go back and look at how some of these offenses evolved and just see Leach has been running almost the same offense, since he started getting into football. Like his play sheet is small. It's the same plays, but it was so good at just, kind of repetition and executing the same plays and knowing how to attack defenses. And you can look at the history of Kentucky's passing stats and just see like the Hal Mumme, Mike Leach era, like those passing offenses are just so much more productive in the 2 years before they came there. They're just not, the stats are not even comparable to what happened after Tim Couch. I think they had 9 passing touchdowns in the 2 previous years before Hal Mumme got there. So just a drastic kind of scheme change, a drastic different approach. At the time, you had Steve Spurrier, the fun and gun, and you had Leach. And Leach and Mumme at Kentucky. So really just drastic, I think, and also influential hire of where offense went at that time.
And so I'm going to use passing attempts as sort of just a benchmark here because it's the simplest way to sort of show the evolution of the game in the SEC. Basically in the 70s, late 70s, the leader in the SEC in pass attempts was under 200 pass attempts per season. Like, just think about that for a second. So somehow, some way, all of a sudden, of all places, Vanderbilt, the first guy ever to throw over 300 passes in a single season was Tommy Farr, actually at Mississippi State in 1968. But the first guy to ever throw more than 400 passes was Whit Taylor at Vanderbilt in 1982. Then Kurt Page set the record the following year with 493 pass attempts. Not until then Shane Matthews in 1992, you mentioned under Spurrier with the fun and gun, of course, also a big part of the evolution of football, 463 attempts. But Kurt Page's 1983 record stood until Mike Leach came along, and it was the first ever 500 attempt quarterback. Again, they went from the late 70s throwing the ball 190 times a game as the leader in the SEC to in basically 20 years, Mike Leach, Tim Couch, they threw the ball 547 times in 97, setting the record. Then they come back in the very next year, 553 times. They set the record the very next season. Of course, Jared Lorenzen sets another record the next year, which is not Mike Leach, but it is 2 years later, but it is still, I believe, Hal Mumme. And if you look today, Will Rogers, 683 attempts is the record. He has, I believe, first, second, fourth, and fifth most attempted pass attempts for a season in the SEC of all time. And he also has all those records for the other conferences too. So like, how do you cannot write the story of college football's history from an evolution standpoint. Like, sure, Don Coryell gets a chapter. Yes, Bill Walsh gets a chapter in the West Coast and the West Coast offense, and Lavelle Edwards, which again is the direct correlation to Mike Leach, who was a student at BYU watching 4 wide in the middle of a 2 tight end I formation era. You cannot write the story of college football and SEC football in particular without all of the influence at the start. And I think what's really interesting about Leach being a West Coast guy, and I hadn't thought about this until just now, but like he really begins his big time college football career in the SEC and he ends his college football career in the SEC, in the best conference in America. Died at 61 years old, of course. And it's a pretty huge chapter. I know I'm repeating myself, but like the statistics are just insane when it comes to the passing offense and what he did. So
in 1990, Florida led the SEC in passing offense at 290 passing yards a game. And you look at what Kentucky, 300 plus passing yards, 365. I mean, it was, I remember, I grew up in the 90s watching the SEC. I saw a lot of Jefferson Pilot sports games with Kentucky. And I remember thinking, man, this is really different. And I remember when Hal Mumme was hired at Kentucky, I got to, at the time, college football wasn't covered like it was now. And, you read the newspaper. I used to get the USA Today, and I saw Hal Mumme being hired, and you read about him, and you read about this offense, and then you actually saw it. And you saw it with Tim Couch being, kind of the point person for it, and just seeing how like different it was at the time. Because Braden, it was 3 yards in a cloud of dust.
Yeah.
It was I formation, pro style offense. And so just to see this wide open offense was a significant change from how things were done at the time.
Well, and he branded it the air raid because he wanted it to be different. He wanted to recruit around the phrase the air raid. He found the air raid siren and was using it at practice and stuff. I believe at Iowa Wesleyan back in the day. And so like he just thought about things so differently. I think again from an X's and O standpoint, I mean Will Rogers, if not for Joe Burrow and Bryce Young, I don't know if you've heard of them.
They're pretty good, I think.
If not for those two, Will Rogers is the single season all-time passing leader in SEC history, and that's a Mike Leach coached player. And that was not this season. That was last season
at Mississippi State too.
Yeah,
I mean that's a pretty big deal.
Yeah, it's so I don't think we can overstate, I guess, what he meant to the SEC and pulling the SEC into the modern world, and then writ large, of course, across college football. Again, it's not just college football. It's not just the SEC. It is Friday nights. It is Sundays. His influence is everywhere. And you mentioned all the names, Dana Holgerson, Art Briles. Like you look at all the different offensive guys for all their off the field weirdness and
Cliff
flaws.
Kingsbury's the coach.
Cliff Kingsbury, Lincoln Riley. Like you just keep going with guys there without Mike Leach. I'm assuming somebody comes along with this style of offense at some point. But what makes all these different passing offenses fun and interesting, and if you want to throw in like RPOs and zone read and triple option and all the different running offenses as well, is that each one, like Bill Walsh had a different strength than Air Coryell, who had a different strength than Lavelle Edwards, who had a different strength than Mike Leach. And Chris Childers is going to mention this as well, and you already have. What Mike Leach's genius was simplicity and repetition. Like go to space, go where they're not, run to grass, repeat over and over and over and over and over again. And he did it in 97 with Tim Couch, and he did it this past season just a couple weeks ago against Ole Miss in the Egg Bowl, which is so weird to say out loud, by the way. So,
well, also I think, how about an appreciation of him as a head coach too, just from winning at difficult jobs. Yeah. Washington State is maybe the 11th, 12th best job in the Pac-12. Texas Tech is also a difficult job. We know Mississippi State's a really difficult place to maintain and continue winning. So I think it speaks to how good of a coach that he was when you can keep doing the same things that you were doing back in 98 and 2000 and 2022 and do it at a high level. And defenses have evolved, but Mike Leach just kept winning and getting Mississippi State the Egg Bowl trophy and finishing the top 25 this year is a pretty big deal.
So you and I will spend a little bit more time on his entire career when it comes to Washington State and Texas Tech and some of those things on the other show. If, again, you want to check that out, the Cover 2 podcast. I do think what's interesting, one more note here before we get to Chris Childers, and then what does Mississippi State do now? Who are the candidates? How good of a job is this? Heisman Trophy stuff, as well as a few other things. Tennessee was probably the closest he ever came to getting a blue blood job, and that was, of course, John Curry flying across the country. You couldn't get in touch with her. With his basically to be fired by the chancellor. And like, I think Mike Leach was going to take the job. I think Mike Leach was going to take the Tennessee job with John Curry. It all blows up. Of course, Phil Fulmer ends up taking the head coach, the AD job. And, the chancellor's out now and the AD's out. But like, I honestly think there's a reason he never really got the blue blood. And some of it's the air raid, some of it's his personality. But I do think Tennessee was the closest he ever came. And he could have been a head coach at a power program with massive resources And it's not a knock on the other places he's coached, but like Tennessee is different when it comes to expectations than the other ones he's been at. So,
man, what if in SEC coaching history? If Tennessee hires Mike Leach instead of Jeremy Pruitt, you could imagine, Mike Leach hanging out with the Vol Navy and all that, being on the river. So, I mean, it would have been awesome to see, just because of his execution, the quarterbacks he could have gotten. Yeah. And like I said, just because he's one of these difficult places, you give him a program with top 25 talent, it would have been fun to see how it played out.
Josh Heupel, of course, played for Mike Leach, so it all comes for full circle. Of course, that was his coordinator in '99. He goes on to win the national championship in 2000, Heisman Trophy finalist, and now leading Tennessee's entire football program. He would not. Josh Heupel probably not there though if Mike Leach is there, because obviously he would have been there last year. So either way, a huge personality, a huge influence on our game. And I wanted to give you guys a sense of kind of who he is. Again, I had a chance to work with him, but very, very briefly. Chris Childers, of course, host of Full Ride's been on the show a bunch. He had a chance to actually work with him for longer, but he and I kind of came up, and I'll say this in the interview, I fell in love with my profession of radio, learning how to ask questions and let somebody kind of take the mic and go, which I'm assuming everybody wants me to do right now, is because Mike Leach would just be so gracious with his time and so interesting to talk to. So without further ado, we will get back to the Mississippi State job. Zach Arnett is now your acting head coach. Steven, I want to know some candidates that you think we can look at. If you're a Mississippi State fan, looking at some candidates, there is a job now that they've got to do with a new athletic director and a new head coach. So time of change for this program, unfortunately, through all this tragedy, thinking about Leach's family and everything. And we'll get into the Heisman vote and all the different coordinators across the SEC as well when we come back. But here was my conversation with the host of Full Ride on SiriusXM with Rick Neuheisel. This was my conversation with good friend and former Mike Leach coworker, Chris Childers. Chris Childers, good to see you, my friend. Obviously, different circumstances, but good to have you on the show. How are you, sir?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
So a part of the reason I wanted to have you on specifically is that you and I both got started Rivals Radio back in the day when satellite radio just got started. I know, obviously, you can listen to him still on SiriusXM on Full Ride, and a big part of sort of getting to know our business and getting to know national college football conversations, Mike Leach was a huge part of that. And I know then you obviously had a chance to get to work with him. I had like a couple of shows I did with him, but by and large, you spent a lot more time with him during his in between Lubbock and Pullman time. And so I wanted to have you on to kind of tell some stories a little bit. So before we get into any of those details, just when I say the word Mike Leach and when you think of college football and Mike Leach, like what is the first thing that comes that like comes into your mind when I say that?
Weird. In the best possible way. Weird. Different. Strange. Exotic. I mean, I can come up with a few different ways to say it, but weird in the fact that he's cut from an incredibly different cloth than every other coach I've ever known or interviewed or talked to or covered.
I would agree. And I would also, I don't know about how you feel about this, and I put it out on Twitter. Like, I always love sports. I always love sports talk. I always enjoyed radio. I got into it and started learning how much I liked it and how much I enjoyed it, also how much I didn't know. But I don't think I truly fell in love with the job, the act itself of broadcasting and talking and interviewing about college football until like Mike Leach would give us like 23-minute long interviews to a couple of guys that were like 24 years old who he had no clue who we just some punk kids like on this random ass satellite channel. But he would give us so much time and he would always tell us these insane stories. Obviously, Wedding Crashers is the thing that I think of first when I think of interviews with Mike Leach. So what did he mean to you in those early days in your career, getting to have those conversations and explore a personality that kind of was breaking onto the scene in 2005, 6, and 7?
Yeah, so I remember when we first had him on, you and I at Rivals Radio, we didn't really know that he was what he is. So there was an interview that you and I don't know if Bill did it or whoever did it, but it was on Rivals Radio. Yeah. It was on Rivals Radio, and we're doing this interview, and we get into some conversation about Vikings and how this little organism.
No. Amazon. It was the Amazon.
It was the Amazon, yes. And the little organism, but Vikings was previous in the conversation. He definitely hit on Vikings at some point. But he's in the Amazon, and there was these little organisms that would swim up your genitalia. And so they had to
swim up
and
your,
he was like having a
swim up
trying
your,
to figure out how to say it. He's like, well, I can't say penis on the radio. And how do I and he said equipment. He's like, equipment.
You got to wear these special shorts.
Yes, he said they came up with like these special shorts in the Amazon, so these little, microscopic fishy things won't swim into your genitals. But he was so fat, and I'm thinking to myself, we're doing this radio show, and I'm like, every other coach we've ever talked to, I've been nervous, and it's all like Coach Speak 101, where they talk about their 3 phases, and they got, and I'm just like, it's all the same. They don't say anything for 15 minutes. Leach has no interest in talking to us about football.
No.
One of my favorite things he talked about was the jackrabbits. Do you remember the jackrabbits?
Oh,
he's like, there was some football playing jackrabbits we'd have on the practice field, like these big old
West
massive
Texas
things. He was just so different.
Yeah.
And that's what I loved the most about him, is that he would tell these stories. And Neuheisel would say, you know how brilliant that is, that he figured out a way to never have to talk about football, even when he lost.
Yeah.
People would just know not to do it, and to bring him down, like, what movie he watched or whatever he saw. And it was a brilliance to it, but it wasn't a calculated brilliance. I think it was just Mike.
And a little bit of stubbornness too, and just like his natural inquisition and like desire to like absorb as much information as possible. It's funny that you bring up the Amazonian fish that swims up your equipment, which is like exactly the cut.
That's how he delivered it. Yeah.
And you were on air a little bit far more than I was at that time, and so I just remember pulling every interview we did with Mike Leach, and we would cut it up into so many different clips that we just had an entire Mike Leach sound drop board. Like there was an entire part of our show that if we needed a drop, there was like a Mike Leach section of drops. And it's funny that you bring up the Amazon conversation first, because again, he was explaining, to give people context, he was trying to explain there's this surfing contest where like you ride, like these guys surf all the way from like the middle of the Amazon all the way out to like the Pacific Ocean. But they have to wear special shorts because of the animals that are going to swim up your equipment. Yeah. And he tells this whole story. And it's funny is that's like the second or third interview that I remember doing with him. The first one was about Wedding Crashers.
Yes.
And about how they were like, I was like, hey, coach, do you take your team to a movie? Like, that's the question. And I learned how to ask like short questions because I knew I just had to get him going. And I almost learned how to interview because of that. And then he would just talk about how Wedding Crashers were game planners and they had to set up their strategy and like I taught my team about the Wedding.
But it was
Crashers.
really analytical. Like I remember the answer, and that's a great movie with Vince Vaughn and Rachel McAdams and Owen Wilson, and he was really analytical about like certain scenes. I remember him talking about like them at the Jewish wedding with the yarmulkes on, and the maple syrup conglomerate, and like he was going into like, and you know why I think he was so interested in it? Because I think in his head, he was trying to figure out what he would be if he's like, hold on a second, could this wedding crash be pulled off? A. And if it can, what would my story be? Would I be the maple syrup conglomerate guy? Would I be, holy shirts and pants? Like I think that's what fascinated him so much. He was always thinking about stuff like that. Like little things that you and I and normal people would just gloss over. It would be like, hold on a second. Maybe this could work. maybe I can do this. You know what I mean?
Do you remember
that would go on in his head?
I no, totally agree. And I always thought you could hear him like part of the reason he talked in the cadence that he talked was that in his head he was already like 2 or 3 sentences ahead in the conversation, and so like he almost like couldn't finish the thing he was trying to say. Yeah, because he was already on to the next topic. Do you remember the one where he talked to us about? First of all, there's a great clip of Mike Leach doing the weather on like local TV and
is it still up? Does it still exist?
If somebody's listening and you find
it,
all he does is he's just like, listen, this is how I do the weather. I go outside and I put my hands in the air. there's a simplicity, but like a genius to it. Do you remember the one where he talked about the track meet in like Montana? And he went up to a track meet
I
when he was in high
forgot.
school.
Yes, I
And
do.
he's like, we stayed in this little motel,
Yes.
but behind us there were some mountains, and not like the pretty mountains, but like leave dead bodies in them kind of mountains.
Yes, I remember that. I totally remember that. The things that would come out of his mouth. That was the beauty of it. You're like, what did he just say? But it was so authentic and so beautiful and so true to him. And it was so different than like juxtapose a Gus Malzahn Auburn press conference to Mike Leach. And
we're gonna run the ball. We're gonna run the ball left. We're gonna run the ball
right.
We're gonna run the ball.
Pretend those guys, like, and just imagine in your head those guys are coaching the same sport in the same league. But they were.
No, we've got Wedding Crashers, the movie. They were game planners. We have small fish that swim up your equipment in the Amazon. We've got mountains that you leave dead bodies in. We've got football playing jackrabbits, not like those regular kind of jackrabbits, but them football playing jackrabbits from West Texas.
Yes.
And that was just like in the first couple of years of our careers in college football. You had a chance to work with him a little bit more in depth. Just your time with him. What is it that you remember the most? Because I know everybody right now this week has all these stories about interacting with him, whether it's a TV broadcast or radio or whatever. What do you remember from the shows and the work that you did with Coach Leach there for a little while?
I specifically, first of all, I was really young. So I specifically remember being young, not knowing what I was doing, trying to be a really straight-laced radio host. And getting this guy on who had no interest in talking about football, had no interest in breaking down the games of the day. And I remember calling the boss at the time, Matt Fishman, and being like, so how do I do this? Because this guy doesn't really watch football. Or he's like, well, let's play to his strengths. So his strengths were being Mike Leach, caring about Pirates and Geronimo and stuff like that, with a little dash, little sprinkle of football mixed in, just a little touch, just so it's a football show.
Right.
But just a little dash of it, and we're not going to focus too much on it. We would get into all kinds of bizarre crap, and if it was the off season, it would get really bizarre and like just kind of wild. But I remember he would have this fascination with me and the fact that for a little while I had a ukulele. And it would always come up, always.
It totally tracks, by the way.
Yeah, well,
like he's living in Key West, and like you're playing the ukulele. Like I
tried to learn how to play guitar, and it just didn't go well. So then I got a ukulele, and I actually played it pretty effectively. It's not very hard at all. Like you can play a song pretty damn easily with 3 chords, and it's so small, the fretboard, where you can get around pretty easy. So
Jack Johnson's made a whole career out of it.
Exactly. So I learned how to do that and play a little Hawaiian songs, and I would sometimes play during commercial breaks, and then it became his obsession. He had to have a Hawaiian song before every show. And if I didn't, if the ukulele wasn't in the room, I'd have to go get it, go downstairs or upstairs, or he had to have his little Hawaiian song or we couldn't do the show. And he would get pissy about it. No, go get it. I don't care where it is. Go get it. I need my little Hawaiian song. So I'd go play him a little Hawaiian song. That was one of my favorite things. One of my favorite things about working with him was what he would do during commercial breaks. He would do a show in Key West. So he would jump in the swimming pool a lot during commercial breaks. You would hear this little little splash. And he's like, how much time? 3 minutes, coach. All right. Then you hear this little splash. And then he's playing around in there, doing a lap or two. Then he's coming out. And we're, back on the show. I'd come back and we're back here on Sirius XM. And he, coach, what'd you think about Alabama? Well, I thought, and then if it wasn't that, he would do push-ups. Commercials, he would be doing ripping off 30 push-ups, and he'd come back and he couldn't breathe. And we'd be on the radio.
We're doing a show here.
I know. But my favorite Leach story ever was when it was a post-game Sirius XM show. November, it was LSU Alabama. I remember it well. LSU Alabama. The game goes off. We go on the air. I get into a big moment with him that happened early in the game, but it changed the entire, outcome of the game and the way things went. First quarter.
Do you remember was this the 9/6/2011 year? Do you remember?
I don't specifically remember. I just remember LSU was wearing white. That's all I remember. They had the white uniforms on. But
because
it's a close game.
10-11 were the 2 years he was out of coaching as a head coach.
Yeah.
From 2010, 2011. Falls.
Yeah. This is one of those.
Pretty big LSU Bama games at that time.
Yeah, pretty big LSU. So I'm asking him, and it's the first segment of the show, and we're playing highlights, and I ask him about this moment. And it was a pivotal, huge moment. And he responded to me. He's like, "Oh, I don't know. I was out fishing today. I didn't watch much football." And we're on a scoreboard show. And I'm thinking to myself, well, this is going to be wonderful for the next 3 hours. I try to pick his brain on what happened in the world of college football. He watched none of it, has no idea that Alabama even won. And yet here we are, breaking down the games of the day. That was my favorite Mike Leach, just classic in his own world moment.
What do you think about Clemson's defensive line? Well, Chris, I didn't watch the game.
No,
so.
I was fishing. Caught a great bass though.
got a big old,
got a nice hybrid bass.
Got a big old marlin out there on the boat today. No, and listen, he what's weird is that, and maybe not weird, but what happens is people like us and all the media that are around college football, we get into these conversations and all the stuff we remember. Like leaving the play sheet on the field in the Texas-Oklahoma game and almost pulling off the upset on purpose, trying to trick the Texas coaching staff, and all the crazy stories that you and I have experienced working with and interviewing him and like all the stuff. But you fail in all of that. I feel like sometimes you forget how incredibly wicked football smart the guy was. It's not, I mean, obviously you're smart if you're going to, if you've got Pepperdine law degree and, you're a history buff and all this stuff. Clearly he's very intelligent, but I think his football acumen almost kind of gets lost in the shuffle. The first guy to ever throw over 500 passes in a single season in the SEC was Tim Couch, and Mike Leach coached. The first guy to ever throw 500 passes in the Big 12 was a Mike Leach coach guy. The first guy to ever hit 600 was a Mike Leach guy. 9 of the top 11 best passing seasons in NCAA history in 3 different conferences are all Mike Leach. And you cannot tell the story of college football without the personality of Mike Leach, sure. But there's also this other side to him that is just, I figured out how to attack a defense through the air better than almost anyone else ever.
Go where they're not. That was his philosophy. Go where they're not. And you know what Urban Meyer told me today? He said what Mike was so hell-bent on, it was about repetition. He would run 4 verticals the entire practice, and it wasn't his mindset was do the play so many times that the player knows all the different variations of what could happen. Different ways to shake a receiver, different ways that could happen in the repetition of it. It's not about the amount of plays or the genius of it. It's about the repetition of this is football. This is what works. This is what we do. And we're going to run it 5 million times so we know every possible outcome potentially that could happen. And my wide receivers are going to know how to adjust because of it. Maybe, pull off the throttle a little bit if they have to on a 4-vert.
Find the grass.
And he believed in that. And you know what? It did him well, didn't it?
It did. I don't think you can write, again, personality aside, I don't think you can write the story of college football, especially in our generation, this generation, let's say the modern era of post BCS in 98. You cannot write the story of college football without a pretty large chunk of it dedicated to Mike Leach.
Totally agree.
Right?
Totally agree. Which is why this sucks.
I know.
I mean, it was just wild that we were all watching the Egg Bowl and watching him beat Kiffin and the impact that it had on the state of Mississippi just 3 weeks ago.
Yeah.
Awful.
Well, I didn't want to end on a somber note, but of course the story itself is somber. And so I wanted to have you on, Chris, because I know you came on recently, but I know for me personally, there were so many moments early in my career where you doubt what you're doing. You're not sure what you're doing. You clearly think you know more than you know, and you don't. And then there are these things that happen where you just go that's why I fell in love with this. That's why I enjoy this. That's why I think the game is fun. That's why, I don't know. And Mike Leach was so gracious with his time
Yes, he was.
Again, in like 2006.
Nobody was ever beneath him, which was the greatest thing about it. Like every single person, whenever I was on the road with him, anybody that approached him, he would talk to him and he'd always ask them questions. So what do you do? So what about your, and he would like genuinely be interested. And that's what was so neat about him.
Listening is a lost art.
Yeah.
It really is.
Did
All
it
right,
well.
Is there anything else you want to add about Mike Leach, the guy, the person?
No,
here?
I just loved him. He was incredibly quirky, fun to work with. I will say that if you ever wanted to envision his home life, imagine the Osborne show when Ozzy would always yell, Sharon! That's what it was like working with him on the radio when he would need anything. Like it was, Sharon would come running. That's what I want to leave you with.
Sharon!
Yes.
Sharon!
Exactly. That was him.
I know you're busy, man. Thank you for giving us some time. We do appreciate it.
Thank you.
And Mike Leach, rarely has there ever been a personality that has such a complex and gravitational force, and that just takes an entire sport by storm. And Mike Leach is one of those guys. So, R.I.P. Mike. Thank you so much, Chris, for joining us. We do appreciate it, man. Thank you, bud.
All right, my man. Yes, thanks for thinking of me today.
That was Chris Childers, of course. Had a chance to work with Mike, and again, he and I just the number of ridiculous things that Mike Leach said to us back when it was Sirius 123, before XM and Sirius merged, before truly even the advent of the smartphone or social media. He was saying insane shit to us, and we could not believe at 2005, 6, and 7 as 24, 23, 24, 25-year-olds that we were having these long, rambling 25-minute conversations with the head coach at Texas Tech. Just could not believe it. So I'm glad you guys got to hear that and appreciate that. Now, Steven, Mississippi State is got to do this now. Obviously, terrible circumstances. Zach Arnett's going to take over. He's a guy that I know you and I have liked for a long time. So first of all, does he have a chance to be the interim? Because we've seen this in other places in the SEC and around the country. Interims are they're sometimes they can be a very popular decision. Zach Arnett's pretty well respected. He's done a pretty good job with the defensive side of the ball. Certainly it's a continuity move. So number one, does he have a chance? And if he doesn't, it is the time of the year to hire coaches. It is after the main hiring round, but Mississippi State is sort of in the offseason here. Who are they looking at? And does Zach Arnett have a chance?
Yeah, I think it's a really kind of delicate balance for Mississippi State, because on one hand, you have all the roster stuff going on right now. You have the transfer portal, you have NFL draft coming up, you have signing day next week. You kind of have to make a decision, unfortunately, whether you want to move to another candidate or keep Arnett on in a full-time role. I think maybe there's one advantage to keeping Arnett on is because you can keep all that together. You have some guys who have already decided to come back next year on defense. You can keep the same scheme in place, and you give him a chance to be the full-time coach, winning on the field next year. Kind of like we saw Jake Dickert do at Washington State, named the interim, the program rallied around him, and he won the full-time job. Really respect the job that Zach Arnett has done as defensive coordinator there. I think he is a rising star in the SEC. So to me, the easiest play would be continuity. You keep him as the head coach for next season and just keep that team together for a year and see where it goes. If you don't, you're right. This is the prime opportunity to hire another coach. Names like Willie Fritz at Tulane, Kane Womack at South Alabama. You could throw out John Summerall at Troy. There's a lot of good up and coming coaches, I think, that would make a lot of sense here if they decide to go somewhere else. Keep in mind, the athletic director search also going on at this time as well. So there's really a lot of turnover and a really tough line to walk if you're Mississippi State.
I do feel like this is why Arnett's going to be named the interim coach. I don't know how long that lasts, but I would assume. I mean, he's already been named like the interim coach. I mean, like in more of a
full time for the
yeah, because I could see them saying, "All right, we need to hire an athletic director. We need to go through the proper search. We've got all this player movement happening, as you talked about." It does feel like Arnett is a pretty smart choice for the short term. Does it mean he's the full-time coach next year and it's just a 1-year deal? Is it a 2 or 3 year deal like Matt Luke got at Ole Miss? I don't know. I do think it's important to remember, though, that this job is pretty hard. Despite the success of both Dan Mullen and Mike Leach.
Dan Mullen is available, by the way.
Yeah, that's true. This is a very difficult job. It is. there's a reason that when Dan Mullen went to like 5 straight bowls, that it was the first time in school history that it had ever happened, because it's a tough job. And NIL money, facilities, location, division, it's probably the 7th job in the SEC West in terms of what you should expect. If you put Nick Saban in all 7 jobs, I think Mississippi State would be at the bottom of the list in terms of winning. So I don't know what kind of candidate they'd be looking. I think if you tell me that Mississippi State's going to end up with Willie Fritz, even though there's a big shift in offensive philosophy there, which is going to be the case anytime you're coming off a Mike Leach tenure, I do think you could do a lot worse than Willie Fritz or Kane Womack. Kane Womack, of course, with a lot more SEC sort of recruiting background at South Alabama.
Yeah, I think if they decide to go outside of Zach Arnett, I still think there's a lot of good candidates. I know, Fritz has been a guy who has kind of maximized resources at every stop. And we see this at Tulane is a really hard job. Yes, it is a big transition, but usually you look at his coaching career, give him 1 year and that program can get flipped in the right direction. Also, more than ever, you can flip a roster fast. You don't have to rely on the 25-man cap anymore. You can bring up all the way to 85. The transfer portal allows you to maneuver quickly. That also kind of gets into the decision if you're Mississippi State and trying to figure this out. I mean, you have a team that can win next year. So do you maintain continuity for next season, or do you sort of look to the future? One thought on this job, and I think going forward, Oklahoma and Texas, of course, will be coming into the league. This job is hard. It might get a little easier if you're not playing all the other teams in the West. If you can branch off and your schedule is playing some teams from the East, if you trade off Alabama for playing Vanderbilt, or you trade off LSU for playing Missouri or something, it gets a little easier, but it's still really hard.
Yeah, if your 3 permanents are like Ole Miss, Kentucky, and Vanderbilt, and you're playing everybody else every other year or every 2 years, like it makes it a little bit easier, which is weird to say considering the conversations in other conferences where it's going to get tougher for teams that are in that pecking order. But I think you're still going to be a tough job. It's still It's still a very, very tough job. So we'll see what they do. I do think there are plenty of good options. You could be in a lot worse shape than having as many winning seasons as this program has had over the last 15 years, again, with Dan Mullen, Mike Leach, and then a little Joe Moorhead mixed in there. Don't forget about that tenure, by the way. All right, you want to get into the Heisman vote here?
Let's do it. I'm interested to see who you voted for 1 through 3.
So I had Caleb Williams number 1, I had Hendon Hooker number 2, and I had Bryce Young number 3. First of all, the trust gives us as voters a lot of leeway for beauty is in the eye of the beholder. So when people get outraged that Hendon Hooker didn't go to New York, I've got a lot of Tennessee friends and family members that are like, I'm just so pissed. And I'm like, it doesn't take anything away from the beating Alabama or 10 wins or anything that Hendon Hooker accomplished this year. He was, I thought, the most outstanding player in the SEC. I thought Bryce Young is the best player in the SEC. I think Jalen Carter was close to getting on my ballot, but he just didn't play enough games. Max Duggan would have been 4th, Jalen Carter 5th. Stetson Bennett nowhere near my ballot. Never even considered him. He's a very, very good player. He probably, as we talked to Michael Bratton last week, will probably get a statue outside of Sanford Stadium, but he's not a top 4 Heisman candidate. I thought that was, again, voters are allowed to do what they want to do. I'm not getting too outraged about it, but you cannot tell me that Hendon Hooker was not the most valuable, most outstanding, most impressive, biggest moments. I mean, he sort of checks every box of a Heisman candidate. If you're talking about SEC players, I just thought Caleb Williams did a little bit more of everything than Hendon Hooker. And that is why a little bit more must-see TV, a little bit more dynamic on the field, a little bit more statistical production, a little just as valuable to his team, got his team to a championship game, played through an injury and put up over 400 yards of offense. I thought Caleb Williams was the definition of most outstanding. But in the SEC, I thought Hendon Hooker was the definition of most outstanding.
You said this a few weeks ago because I've wrestled with the Bryce Young, Hendon Hooker debate on my all SEC team. Like I wasn't sure. Like this isn't a knock on Stetson Bennett. It's just that I just think that these two quarterbacks are the best in the SEC. And I think you said it best. Hendon Hooker had the best season. Bryce Young is the better player. And I think when you start diving into the stats, I mean, they both played 7 games in the SEC. Hendon Hooker, 9.2 yards per attempt. Bryce Young, 8.6. 69.1% completion percentage for Hendon Hooker. Hendon Hooker also had 19 points higher in quarterback rating in SEC play, and also was more productive on the ground. And you just see the steps that Tennessee took this year offensively. We wondered what was the next step after they went from, bottom to the top of the SEC last year. They found that next year. They beat up on LSU. They beat Alabama. They beat Florida like 10-2. This is a pretty impressive season for Josh Heupel and Tennessee, and Hendon Hooker was a big part of that. So I hate to be boring, but I don't disagree with your Heisman ballot. I do like Jalen Carter. I think I would have given him probably a little bit more consideration had he played the full season. Also, I think Brock Bowers from Georgia's in the same boat too. Like, he's insanely talented. He probably just won't have the stats to appeal to Heisman voters.
I almost came into the season telling myself, like, I'm going to vote for Brock Bowers no matter what happens. Like, and I know that's not the right way to do it, but like, I was just like, this is going to be the guy I'm going for no matter what, because I just think he is the freakiest of freak athletes. I think he's the best athlete. Him and Will Anderson are the best two athletes. I mean, there's other guys, right? We got Harold Perkins now. We've got, Mason Smith didn't play this season. Jalen Carter's probably the best actual football player. So there's just so much good stuff in there. So, by the way, Eddie, do you vote for the Eddie Robinson Coach of the Year, by the way?
I do.
I think you do. So I do too. And I'm not going to say who I voted for, but I was shocked that Josh Heupel was not on that list.
I was too. I was really surprised.
What are we doing?
In fairness, there were several qualified coaches on there.
Sure.
But I was surprised that Heupel wasn't on. I'm guessing the
Kirby Smart was on there from the SEC, and I was like, no.
I can understand.
I mean, I get it, but
I can understand him being on there just because they lost so much from last season. And if we're making the argument they're the best team in college football, the fact that they lost all those guys to the NFL and they still reloaded and were the best team, like, I get it. I'd vote Heupel SEC Coach of the Year, by the way.
Yes, I would as well. I think Shane Beamer deserves some consideration in conversation in
Brian Kelly
as well. Brian Kelly does as well. So I would have Kirby Smart fourth on my SEC ballot, and he was one of, I think, 7 finalists. I do think John Summerall from Troy, who should be a candidate at Mississippi State, was on that list. So was Willie Fritz. So again, 2 names we've already mentioned for the Mississippi State job were on this ballot. It was Sonny Dykes, Mike Elko from Duke, who's done a great job in year 1. You had Kirby Smart on there. Who am I missing?
Was it Harbaugh on there too?
I think Jim Harbaugh was on there as well. And I was like, you vote for 5 out of the 7, and Kirby Smart, and like didn't even cross my mind to put Kirby Smart on my top 5. So out of 5 out of 7, I was like, no, top 3 in the SEC would be Josh Heupel, number 1, Brian Kelly, number 2, probably Shane Beamer, number 3. Those are probably my top 3 if I was voting Coach of the Year in the SEC.
I'd still give consideration for Kirby.
All right.
But I don't know that that's the thing. I don't know that I could put him ahead of any of those others. Like, they're all deserving. Like, Kelly, the fact that LSU won the SEC West in a year where we thought they were going to be like 7-5, 8-4 is a pretty big deal, and they beat Alabama. And I think Shane Beamer's candidacy made the late push at the end because they beat Tennessee and they beat Clemson. So there's no wrong answer here. I think if I had to vote 1, I would immediately write in Heupel.
Yes.
2, 3, 4 would be a much tougher debate. Like, I feel good about any of those 2, 3, or 4.
Now, if Heupel was on my national ballot, I would not have voted him number 1 nationally. That would go to the gentleman in Fort Worth.
Yeah,
I agree. Even though he didn't win his conference, I would still probably vote for Sonny Dykes over Josh Heupel. I mean, but I would again, John Summerall, Willie Fritz were 2 of my guys that I voted for in that ballot. And those are 2 names that if you are a Mississippi State fan, do some digging. Do some digging on Troy and Tulane, and you'll like what you see. I promise. Listen, John Summerall's been on this show before, so like we had him on this summer, and we told people before he's coached a single game at Troy to watch this man coach. So
it was a good year for coaches on the fringe element.
Fringe element.
Shane Beamer,
yeah,
John Summerall.
There you go. Don't worry about Sam Pittman.
It was a good start before KJ Jefferson got hurt and there were
right.
some other injuries.
So speaking of Sam Pittman here, and we'll wrap up the show. Go to J.E. Dunn, by the way. I want to talk coordinators here with you, Stephen, but make sure you go to J.E. Dunn, jedunn.com, our wonderful and amazing sponsor. These are folks that care deeply about the people around them. They want you to come work for them. So if you're looking to make a career change, go to jedunn.com. Check out the website. This is a top 100 healthiest place to work in America. $5 billion in annual revenue, offices all across the country, over 200 jobs available. They are looking to make your career more inspiring and more fulfilled, Stephen. More inspiring, more fulfilled. I don't know. Like,
what else do you need?
And they have all these fancy things at their office. Like, if you think an SEC facility is fun, and you think you walk in, You see J.E. Dunn's waterfall? Holy smokes. Big
Lazy
waterfall.
River,
Lazy River.
waterfalls.
Now we're just making shit up. They don't have any of that stuff. But they do have like a video game room, like a record playing room, a music listening room. They have 2 big green eggs, and this is just in their Nashville office, so I can't speak to all the other offices. But just spectacular digs for you to go work in, because they want you to be happy and fulfilled and feel like you're a part of the team and buy into what they're selling. And if you buy in, you get rewarded for that. And it's just not that difficult to care about the people you work with and work for you. So again, JEDunn, jedunn.com. It's just a novel concept, Stephen. Care about the people that work for you, and they will be happier and healthier and more productive and more loyal to your cause. It's just not that complicated.
I think Sam Pittman, Shane Beamer, and Mark Stoops are pretty good coaches to work for, don't you? Pretty good culture. They seem to care about your future.
I would imagine.
They're top of the list.
Although, not every coordinator on Mark Stoops' staff. Now, Shane Beamer and Sam Pittman have to replace some guys. That's different. They left to go take bigger jobs, right? Like Barry Odom is now, the head coach at UNLV. Marcus Satterfield left to go offensive coordinator for South Carolina. He's now up at Nebraska. It's a bigger job than South Carolina. But Rick Scarangello is not at Kentucky because Mark Stoops loved him.
Yeah. It was a rough year for Kentucky offensively. That's not necessarily all of his fault, but the coordinator change to Liam Cohen is a good thing for Kentucky.
And you did not mention Jimbo Fisher, because who knows who wants to work at Jimbo Fisher? Who knows about the culture at Texas A&M? They got a bunch of dudes in the portal. So does Arkansas, and they've got a bunch of coaches to replace. So let's get into this list. Go to J.E. Dunn, by the way, jedunn.com. Let's get into this list of a bunch of changes at the coordinator positions and really break it all down for everybody. We'll do some pluses and some minuses. We'll grade some of these hires, and then we'll just cross our fingers, get down on our knees, and beg and plead and pray to whatever God you pray to that Bobby Petrino is the offensive coordinator for Jimbo Fisher and Texas A&M. Can we all agree on that?
Yes. Can you just imagine the volcanic implosion factor of having Fisher, Petrino, Adazio, and Durkin on the same staff, potentially in the same room, arguing about schemes and recruiting and everything else? So it's got some serious potential.
Hey, whose scandal is worse? Let's just see. He'll see whose scandal is worse. DJ, obviously DJ Durkin's scandal was the worst. But then you got the motorcycle thing and Bobby and all of Jimbo's Jameis Winston stuff. Like, it's just
Adazio has a long list of stuff from Colorado State too.
Yes, he does. It's not as bad as some of the other stuff, but it's not great.
It's not great.
It's not great, Dan. Not great, buddy. God, what a volatile coaching room. Just like personality, like there is no way. So here's the thing. As a content person, I would love to see Bobby Petrino be this guy at that place, because I think it would be it's almost as bad as hiring Hugh Freeze at Auburn in terms of volatility. But like, there's no possible way it would work. Like, he would be very good offensively. If Jimbo Fisher truly turned it over and took a step back, Bobby Petrino knows how to run an offense. But there's no way all those personalities you just mentioned will all get along and last for an extended period of time at Texas A&M. No chance.
No chance. Now, I think if you wanted to take the optimistic route, it's what you said. When I think about Jimbo Fisher and Petrino, I don't think what they do is like drastically different. Petrino's not going to come in and try to throw it 60 times a game. He'll try. You've said this many times when Bobby Petrino was at Arkansas. Run game, offensive line. Mm-hmm. Like, those are the things that appeal to Jimbo Fisher, like building an offense around the offensive line and the run game. So it's not drastically different. Petrino's a great play caller. For all of everything, all the baggage he's got, he can build an offense. He can call plays. Also, if you're A&M, do you want to hire somebody who's, I guess, going to be taking are they going to be a strong enough personality to tell Jimbo, like, this is my offense, I'm calling my plays, it's not your offense anymore? I think Petrino can do that. If you go out and hire somebody who's maybe his first time as a play caller, or he's been at a lower level, he may not get that freedom. Petrino will make it clear to Fisher that this is his offense.
I agree with you, but that's a lot. There's a lot of risk that comes along with
that. A lot of ifs.
Yeah, risk and ifs that comes along with that confidence. But again, we can all, T's and P's to Texas A&M, whoever gets that job coaching the offense for Jimbo Fisher. Because again, we don't know how much he's going to let it go. And you got some other big personalities in that coaching room. And the noise around the program with the fan base is not going to go away. I know they love him. They loved him at the start of the year. I think they love him a little less now, but he's still their guy. He ain't going anywhere, and they ain't spending $86 million to fire him. So this is, you are in bed, folks. You gotta figure out how to make it all work. And my God, Bobby Petrino. Hugh Freeze and Bobby Petrino back in the SEC West in the same year. What are we doing?
This is awesome.
Unbelievable. All right, let's get to the rest of these coordinator moves that have taken place so far in the SEC. I think Arkansas actually might be one of the biggest ones we need to discuss with the loss of Barry Odom to UNLV, as we mentioned. But I asked this question last week of Michael Bratton, who was on the pod last week. Of course, you can listen to him, that SEC podcast. And I have a feeling you probably agree with this. Tennessee, South Carolina, Kentucky all have to replace their coordinators and all have to replace their quarterbacks to varying degrees of sort of productivity this past year. I assume that you agree. Michael said Tennessee. I tend to agree that Tennessee has the easiest time of replacing those two pieces. Do you agree that Tennessee is the easiest of those three in terms of replacing the production from last season?
Yeah, I do. I would go with Tennessee. I think, first of all, it is Josh Heupel's offense. And Alex Golesh, I know, played some role in some of the things that you see schematically and all that. But still, this is Josh Heupel's offense. He plays a big role in game plan, play calling, and all that. So I think if you're a Tennessee fan, you can't be too worried about losing an offensive coordinator when the head coach designs the offense and runs it. The quarterback position is much more interesting to me at Tennessee because you have Joe Milton, who's going to make a start in the Orange Bowl against Clemson. We'll be curious to see how he plays against a good defense. And also just looking ahead, we still have the transfer portal. Tennessee could add somebody. They've got a 5-star freshman. Like, their quarterback room is already, they at least have a starting option, and they have another guy coming in that could start at some point next year. I do think one thing to keep in mind, we'll talk about Kentucky, is Kentucky's got two really good freshman receivers in Dane Key and Barry and Brown. So the next quarterback, whoever he is taking over maybe two of the more talented playmakers that Kentucky could have in some time, because of what we've seen with Wandale Robinson and Tavion Robinson the last couple of years. These two guys are going to be really good.
I do think I don't. You guys know I'm not a big Joe Milton guy. I think they can win 7-8 games with him. I'm not sure 10 is going to be doable with him. He's a nice stopgap until either Nico Yamaleava gets there or somebody new. I agree that it's Tennessee. They have the easiest time of it because it's Josh Heupel's offense, and they have Joe Milton, who's been around for 1,000 years. So like they've got a little bit more there to work with. Excuse me. I will be interested to see though if they go into the portal, because I think like DJ Uiagalelei, ironically, their opponent played at Clemson. I think he actually would fit in Josh Heupel's offense very, very well. Athletic guy who can run a little bit, quick reads, simplify the offense so he's not so complicated for him. I think it could be a really nice fit there at Tennessee. Kentucky they go back to Liam Cohen. Again, this is a coordinator who was there with Will Levis 2 years ago. They had one of their best seasons offensively. It felt like Kentucky finally figured out how to evolve. He goes to work back for the Rams. The 1 year he's gone, of course, they win a Super Bowl. Poor guy. He goes back. He's off the Sean McVay tree. They hire Scarangello off the Shanahan tree, but they're very similar, of course, in their style. Levis, because of the offensive line, largely major step back, but then they go back to him, and now he's their new offensive coordinator. I can't remember a time that's happened in a 1 year span. It's kind of an odd move. What do you make of Cohen coming back to run Kentucky's offense?
I love this hire. I mean, you can just look at the stat sheet the last couple of years, 5.1 yards per play in the SEC in the year prior to when Cohen got to Kentucky, 5.82 his year at Kentucky, and then 4.98 this year. So clearly the production was there. But I also thought if you just watch Kentucky, they had a little bit more creativity on offense. And I think they didn't necessarily go away from what Stoops wants to do from an identity standpoint. They want to be able to run the ball, be physical. You saw that. They were creative with some formations and different plays that they used. Also, I think his work with Will Levis, I think will be, something they can use on the recruiting trail too. I mean, they need to find a quarterback in the portal. So it's very easy to go to recruits and say, hey, I worked for the Rams and I worked with Matthew Stafford, and look what Will Levis is going to do in the NFL draft. So that would have to be very appealing. And we just talked about how they have some talented receivers coming in. So I think getting Cohen back to run, it's not a drastic offensive switch. It worked before. I think it's a great fit once again for Kentucky.
Yeah, I really like the move. It's just weird. It just
Very
was
weird.
weird. Marcus Satterfield leaves South Carolina to take the same job at Nebraska. Is this a good thing for South Carolina or a bad thing for South Carolina? Which is it?
I thought it was a good thing for South Carolina until I saw the hire of Dow Loggins as offensive coordinator. I mean, statistically, South Carolina's offense was better this year than it was last year. Of course, they played the quarterback injury carousel last year, so it was a lot of bad luck. But this year they were better. My question with South Carolina has been, why did it take until the end of the season to get the kind of production that we saw against Tennessee and we saw against Clemson? So all of the pieces, yes, it took some time for them to get acclimated to the offense, but still it shouldn't have taken 10 games for South Carolina to figure it out. So I was a little puzzled by what Satterfield was doing most of the year. I'm a little puzzled by what South Carolina it will be doing under Dow Loggins now. It's a really curious hire.
I did enjoy, though, and maybe it was just because Spencer Rattler just figured it out in the last 2 games. I don't know, but like they were pretty creative with how they were using their pieces. They were creative with which guys were lining up where, and the tight ends being running backs and running backs being quarterbacks and quarterbacks being tight ends. And like it was fun to watch there, especially against Tennessee and against Clemson. Loggins, and again, I cover the Tennessee Titans for my company here locally as well as for ESPN, and he is not a well-respected offensive coordinator from Tennessee Titans fans. Like they joke about 2012, 2013 because that was, I mean, it wasn't quite the 5-27 record that was. I think it was 2014 and 15, but that Tennessee Titans fans are not, sorry, South Carolina fans, but Tennessee Titans fans do not have fond memories of Dow Loggins. Now, NFL and SEC coordinators are very different. They just are. Matt Rule's a terrible NFL coach, darn good college coach. Steve Spurrier, Bobby Petrino, Nick Saban, we can go down the list. They're not the same necessarily, but being here in Nashville and living through the Loggins era of offensive coordinating, it wasn't particularly fond part of time for the fan base here for Tennessee Titans. So yeah, strange hire by Shane Beamer. We'll see.
Not just the Titans. He's been an offensive coordinator at a couple other stops in the NFL too, and none of them were particularly prolific. Now, like you said, NFL and college, totally different things. He's gotten good, I think, reviews for his ability to recruit. So I think that's pretty attractive if you're South Carolina. I think that my takeaway in South Carolina has been they made significant strides under Shane Beamer, just getting from last year, getting to the bowl game, finishing the year on a high note. They took another step forward this year. Is this the offensive coordinator that's going to take you from 8-4 to 10-2 and higher in the SEC? No. I have a really hard time understanding why he's the hire and why you don't go out and get someone else that's maybe a little bit more proven on the college level. Also, you mentioned it. I mean, Jaheim Bell was one of those pieces they moved around last year and this year. He transferred. Marshawn Lloyd, he transferred. They could have some attrition at receiver. Spencer Rattler could be gone. This seems like a really curious hire. Shane Beamer's hired, I think, pretty good assistant coaches so far. Yeah. But this one, I don't really understand.
Yeah, I'm kind of with you on that one. Auburn, it looks like it's going to be Ron Roberts on defense, who was fired recently. He's going to be he's the Baylor defensive coordinator. Phil Montgomery looks like the former Tulsa head coach is going to be the offensive coordinator, according to reports. What do you make of the staff that, in general, the staff that Hugh Freeze is putting together? Obviously, Cadillac Williams at the top of that list.
I like it. I think Phil Montgomery is a heck of a coach. I think his record at Tulsa, it's a tough job. I wouldn't read too much into that. But I think you saw at Tulsa that style of play can work well at Auburn. The fact that they're going to build around the offensive line, rushing attack, take those deep shots. It's a Baylor-style offense, much like you've seen at Ole Miss and Tennessee, some offshoot of that. I was shocked when Ron Roberts was fired at Baylor. I mean, he and Dave Aranda are close. The defense at Louisiana and Baylor, both under his watch, made significant strides. So I actually think this is a really good start to Auburn's staff. I think they really nailed their 2 coordinator hires.
I mean, Dave Aranda is the guy. So he does run the defense at Baylor. He is the kind of the architect of it all. Very cerebral dude. I am curious why that happened as well. Is that personality conflict? Is it recruiting? Is it? It's just a storyline. I don't think it necessarily means it's a bad or a good hire for Hugh Freeze. It's just interesting, and just a fascinating staff full of a bunch of guys with a lot of bullet points on their resume. so all right, quickly, I think the most important one, honestly, of all of these, outside of Cohen to Kentucky, frankly, and obviously, God willing, Bobby Petrino to A&M. I think the most interesting one and most like difficult one to pinpoint, and the one that probably has the most impact on the head coach's future is Sam Pittman replacing Barry Odom at Arkansas. I think a lot of Arkansas fans are sort of on Kendall Briles. I think they're fine with him. He had good moments. He has some bad moments. I don't think he's particularly special. I think he's fine. I don't think he's great. But I thought Barry Odom is part of the reason that this team was so good 2 years ago. They had a lot of injuries this past year. But I think part of Sam Pittman's allure is his ability to keep his staff together and build a really strong staff the way Shane Beamer has. These other guys that don't have a ton of head coaching X's and O's experience. Now he's got to replace his defensive guru. And for the first time, we're going to see if Sam Pittman can rebuild a coaching staff, which I think is a really big question about the future of Arkansas football.
Especially after this season, where I think you could argue they underachieved.
Yeah,
I mean,
sure.
of course, they started out great. There was the weird play against Texas A&M. Momentum shifted in that game after that. Then, of course, KJ Jefferson got hurt, and then the season just never got on track. And of course, they closed with a loss to Missouri. That certainly didn't sit well for Arkansas. So I think it's really important, but it's also important from the program standpoint, but it's also important from a defensive standpoint. When you look at their defensive stats this year, I mean, they struggle to stop the pass, yards per play, scoring defense, all of those metrics, not good. I don't know that that's all Barry Odom's fault. I think there were some personnel deficiencies, but now you're going to rebuild next year without Drew Sanders, without Bumper Pool. You've lost some guys in the portal. You're going to have to rebuild quickly on the defensive side of things. So they've already brought in a couple transfers on offense that'll help solidify receiver, offensive line, and the backup quarterback situation. But defense, coordinator, and personnel is a big question. So I think Ron Roberts was a candidate at Arkansas. So the fact that he went to Auburn will be something to watch for sure going forward.
No, he picked Auburn over Arkansas in theory. So that'll be interesting to keep an eye on. That is sort of the rundown of all the coordinators. I know we touched on it briefly last week. I wanted to dive a little bit deeper into it this week. And then, of course, obviously, all the Heisman news, the award news, and sadly, the passing of Mike Leach at 61 years old. Again, 158 wins, 107 losses. This is a guy who I believe went to a bowl game in all but 2 of his seasons. That's 19 bowls, I think, in 21 years. And only 3 losing seasons his entire head coaching career, and is responsible for so much of the offensive development in our game and in the SEC. And what a weird, quirky, fun, interesting, stubborn at times, not perfect personality, but a huge part of this chapter of college football. So special thanks to Chris Childers for hanging out with us. Special thanks to our primary sponsor who brings you this podcast and brings you this show on YouTube for free every single week, J.E. Dunn, Stephen.
We love J.E. Dunn. We can't say enough about how wonderful they are. They're a wonderful sponsor. They're a wonderful place to work. If you want a career change, or if you want to work for people that care about you, want you to continue to succeed in your career, it's J.E. Dunn.
There you have it. jedunn.com, careers, over 200 jobs available across the Southeast, $5 billion in annual revenue, top 100 healthiest place to work. I don't know how many times we have to say all of these things before you just listen up and go apply for a new career. Quit quiet quitting and just actually quit. Go to J.E. Dunn. You'll be treated way better. You'll be more fulfilled, more inspired. You'll feel like you're accomplishing something with a team, which is like sort of the whole point of having a job. It's not just to punch a clock and to make somebody else a bunch of money. That's not the point. So, all right. Special thanks to Childers for hanging out with us, of course. R.I.P. Leach, R.I.P. Pirate. Swing your sword, man. You meant a lot to this game. You meant a lot to me. And I appreciate Childers giving us a few minutes. I appreciate you, Stephen Lassen, for filling in for Aaron. So thank you so much for doing that. Where can people find all your work?
Thanks for having me. Hopefully the backup quarterback had a decent performance here as I filled in for Aaron, but you can follow me on Twitter at AthlonSteven, and you can follow all my work at athlonsports.com and all CFB 365 on YouTube.
We run a totally different offense with you. They're far less insulting to me when you're here. You're much nicer to me than she is. So it's less insults at me and more like who's in the transfer portal for Arkansas. So we run a totally different offense when you're around. So it's fun. Hopefully everybody enjoyed that. Rate, review, subscribe, share the product. Go to J.E. Dunn, everybody. For Stephen, I'm Braden. Thanks for listening. This has been Fringe Element here on the 440 Sports Network.